So as the scripture was being read, I was reminded of, I don't know if anyone's been to Camp Timberley. It's kind of out by like past Lake Geneva area, and they have a nature center there. And they did something where they created like 7 different rooms, one for each day of creation, so that you walk through this room and hear the scripture read, and it's day 1, and then the next room, and it's day 2. And it's been quite a few years since I've been there, but I remember it being really cool. So if you find yourself out that way, I think you can just stop in and kind of walk through those 7 days of creation. So this morning we're going to talk about creation, and we're going to kind of talk about integrating the 14 billion year history of the universe with 2,000 plus year old texts, which is kind of a fun and challenging thing to do. Has anyone seen any of these bumper stickers or ones like them? I kind of use bumper stickers as like a test to figure out what the real cultural hot button issues are. And when I was a salesperson, I spent a lot of time in the car, so I got to see a lot of anger and angst expressed in bumper sticker form. But these are kind of an indicator of how much conflict there has been between faith and science, and specifically between the Christian faith and theories about the origins of the universe and origins of life on Earth. So it's a conflictual issue. And it's not just in the bumper stickers, but even on a larger scale. And so this is, if you're not familiar with this, this is the Creation Museum in Kentucky that was built a handful of years ago. And it's created by an organization called Answers in Genesis. And sort of their mission is to promote young Earth creationism. So the idea that the Earth is 6,000 or 7,000 years old, and to kind of combat the theory of biological evolution. And depending on your perspective, this could be a really cool thing, it could be a really odd thing, it could be a really bad thing, but I think it's a really interesting thing because it kind of points to how big of a conflict this is, that millions of dollars are raised to create a museum that offers a different scientific story than the one that you might find at the Field Museum. And it's the conflict. This is a cartoon that a science teacher in Georgia got in a lot of trouble for showing a class, but a lot of times it's kind of painted in these good and evil, God versus the devil sorts of terms. So it's a pretty serious issue, and I guess that raises the question of why talk about something where there's so much conflict, because it's easier not to. For me, there's a lot of reasons. One is that it's really interesting. Right? I mean, it's interesting to explore how science and faith connect. But also I think it's an act of worship and discipleship, because one of our most basic confessions is that God created our universe. And so trying to understand how that happened and then how that integrates with our faith is one of the ways we live out our faith. A third reason is kind of, I think, more of a pastoral reason, and that's that this is an area of dissonance for a lot of Christians. So trying to integrate faith and science is something that creates tensions for a lot of people. And those are resolved in different ways. Some people compartmentalize. The Creation Museum, that's one way, right? That's one way of responding to the dissonance. Another way is that people just leave churches and people leave Christianity. And a lot of people are, concerned about millennials becoming nuns, N-O-N-E-S, like non-religious people. And this is one of, in a lot of surveys, this is one of the big reasons why, is the sense that churches have not integrated faith and science, but have sort of pitted them against each other. So there's reasons to explore this, just to, I think, help ourselves live more faithfully and reduce some of this unfortunate tension. And I think if we're going to look at creation and evolution and faith and science from an Anabaptist perspective, we have to engage Scripture. And Genesis 1 is not the only text by any means that addresses creation in the Bible, but it's the first one, and it's the one that gets turned to a lot. And when we come to that text, we can ask lots of different questions. We could ask modern scientific questions. We could ask literary questions. Literarily, it's a beautiful text with a lot of really cool symmetry and balance in it. but we can also ask historical questions. So what might this text have meant, and how might it have functioned in the ancient Near Eastern world, in a world that's very different from our own? And one of the things that scholars have found as they've read this sort of in light of that broader context is that it very much reflects, affirms, and speaks into the cosmology of that day, sort of the picture of the universe that people had in that day and at that time. And I like to think of it as a snow globe cosmology. So you have basically Earth is a flat disk, and underneath that there's stuff like columns, think of a foundation, and then these watery depths where sometimes mythological creatures that are quite ferocious live. And then, of course, you have mountains and valleys, and the Earth's not completely flat. And then around that, you have this dome. And so I think that was the TNIV we read this morning that called it a vault, I think. And some translations will say expanse. The old ones will say firmament. The NRSV says dome. So it's this kind of idea that basically, I like dome the best, that there's this dome that covers the Earth. And it's got flappers in it that can allow things to come in and out. Things like rain. So if you think about in the flood, the Earth is flooded because geysers come up, water from the deep, and then these flaps are open, the floodgates of heaven, and all of this water comes in. And above this dome is water. We have celestial objects that are either part of the dome or they slide in through the ends, through these gates that open, and they come across the sky and then exit and do it all over again. And then, of course, heavenly beings are a part of this. So, the heavens is where God's throne might be, up above there. So this is what a lot of ancient people thought. And if you think about it, if you go out in a tall hill in a relatively flat place, and look around you, just kind of do a 360. I mean, this vision of the world makes a lot of sense. It feels like we've got this really cool dome around us, and the idea that waters are up above makes sense because water's constantly coming down. The sky's blue, so it makes a lot of sense observationally in that time. And so, with that sort of scientific context in mind, it's a question of, well, what is Genesis doing in that context? And it seems that the author or authors of Genesis 1 are sort of assuming the scientific worldview and then trying to tell the story in a way that builds faith, trying to tell the story in a way that speaks truth to the community of faith in that setting. And one of the things that's really cool is it tries to tell it in a way that roots the community's core convictions and practices in this much bigger, much older story. So it's not an accident that it's 7 days of creation and it ends with God resting, because this is a way of rooting this very important practice of Sabbath observance, in the cosmos itself, right? In the story of creation. And so we can imagine this being a very life-giving story in that context. And if you look at that picture down there on the bottom, that's a picture of the god Marduk in combat with Tiamat, a sea god. And there's a popular story in the ancient world where this creation happened in the midst of conflict between the gods. So Marduk wars with Tiamat, and in the end rips Tiamat apart, using part of her body to create this dome with the waters above, and part of the body to create what's below. And so, in light of that, Genesis 1, I think from our perspective, offers a relatively nonviolent presentation of creation. That God speaks and it happens. And Genesis 1, that stream of Genesis, creatures are actually vegetarian to begin with, and it's kind of only later after the flood that things and people start really eating each other. So within that context, it's very life-giving in that sense as well. And so kind of if we take that understanding or that interpretation, it's a question for me of, well then what? What do we do with this text? What does it mean? Because our vision is a little bit different than the snow globe. This is, we have 13.7 billion years and this amazing long tree of life. This is how scientists tend to understand the origins of our universe and life today. And so I think maybe one response that a lot of people take is to think that, well, Genesis 1 is kind of useless, right? Like it's this nice relic from a long time ago, but we can kind of set it aside like we set aside other ancient myths. I don't think that we should or have to do that personally. I think that Genesis 1 can still be understood in this context as inspiring, as inspired, as life-giving. And for me, one of the ways that I understand it is to see Genesis 1 as prototype. So rather than, we have to kind of, take and try to integrate the specific details with a modern scientific worldview, we look at, well, what were the people doing when they told this story? And how are we called to do the same thing? Right? So if they were trying to speak something life-giving within what their neighbors knew about the ancient world, then how do we similarly speak something life-giving within that context? And if you think about it, if the ancient Israelites had, somehow gotten a hold of, something written by Charles Darwin and tried to tell a creation story in their time in light of that, it probably wouldn't have gotten very far because it went against the grain of what people knew or believed about the universe. And, we can have a similar issue today if we try to, I think, push scientific ideas that are not, consensus ideas, maybe, in our time. And so I think what we can maybe end up with is a task of looking at what Genesis 1 2015 Anabaptist edition might look like. So what does it look like for us in the 21st century to engage a text like Genesis 1, to engage our faith, and then tell the story of creation in a way that takes into account what we know about the universe now, which is always changing, but what we know now with our faith. And to do it in a way that roots our core convictions, what we believe at a most fundamental level to be true in a story much bigger than ourselves. For us, it's probably not going to be Sabbath. It's going to be things like being Christ-centered, or it's going to be things like our commitment to nonviolence. So what does that look like? What is that that story, Genesis 1 2015 edition look like? And just kind of as a fun aside, one of the growing areas of scholarship in the study of ancient Judaism and ancient Christianity is asking sort of history of science questions. So basically, the Greeks, for instance, a lot of them found out that the Earth's not flat, right? They were able to find out, long before us that the Earth is not flat. And so as the scientific worldview changed, even in the ancient world, we see Jews and Christians that were sort of retelling or trying to re-understand Genesis 1 and other texts of Scripture within their changing understanding of the universe, which is kind of cool. So we're not really doing anything all that new. So I just wanted to maybe offer, because mostly I'm hoping to just sort of start a conversation, but to offer a few things we might consider in that process of Genesis 1 2015 Anabaptist edition. And for me, these sorts of discussions should always begin with awe. And that's what I love Psalm 8 so much, is this sense of awe and this experience of the psalmist both being put in his place and realizing that he's not God, but also having his value affirmed at the same time, right? This really cool tension, and the sense that it leads to worship. And I think that if we're talking about creation, that awe is our first response. And so we might ask, in that picture, or those pictures of the universe, our modern understanding of the universe and its history that we saw up there, what fills us with awe in that story? And for me, so one of the things that fills me with awe is this sense that our bodies tell this very, very old story. And this is, I think, a very, very cool thing. So the evidence for biological evolution is not just fossils in the ground or what Darwin saw birds doing on an island. It's in our bodies. And as people have been able to sort of read DNA, right? I mean, I like to think of DNA, it's like a book. It's got all of this information that tells us how we're related to other things and that tells, how old things are, this very old and complicated and interesting story. But we see it in other ways as well. So, and I'm not a scientist, so I'll give a disclaimer that anything I say, think of it like a Wikipedia entry, that there may be like a kernel of truth, but you might need to check with a more reputable source. But one of the things that's cool is the way as fetuses develop, that it still tells this story. So in the fetuses of a lot of creatures, there's, for a time, these things that look like gills. And a lot of scientists believe that basically is kind of this lingering remain of when we used to have gills, or our ancestors had gills. There's a little bit there from Richard Dawkins about the eye, and like reading Richard Dawkins stuff in church is, it's an act of civility. He probably wouldn't reciprocate, but one of the things that's really cool to me is sort of this sense that if you brought together modern engineers and you sat them down and you said, build us the most efficient, effective, highly intelligent biped that you can, they probably wouldn't come up with the human being. Because scientists have identified all of these, what some people call design flaws in the human being. Things that, they work, but, they could be tweaked to be a little bit better, a little bit more efficient. And the eye is a big example where basically like photoreceptors are backwards and, light's got to kind of travel through all of this stuff to get to them. So some of these things where it's like, well, that seems like kind of an odd design. And the explanation for that often goes back to how these things evolved, right? That these are things that grow and emerge over time, and that things that from a modern design perspective might seem inefficient develop as part of that process. And I guess from one perspective that could be threatening. To me, I find that awe-inspiring. When the psalmist talks about being, fearfully and wonderfully made, I think that, that's an example of that. That it's, there's a level of character in that, right? That we have these flaws and inefficiencies that tell us that we're part of this big, long, wonderful story. And I remember actually Jeff Yorty was telling me once about this Japanese book, this I think it was Wabi Sabi maybe, this art style that just really resonated with his aesthetic, with what he thought was beautiful. And a big key of it that he expressed was this idea of artists intentionally creating things that aren't flawless, that aren't perfect, but intentionally having these oddities or these things that we might look at as flaws because it actually made the end result, kind of less clinical, I guess, more organic, more beautiful. And for me, we see that with the process. And that's a python skeleton. So I guess the theory is that snakes used to have legs, and you can still see sort of like hip bones that still exist a little bit in pythons. And it really has to fill me with awe because I'm afraid of snakes. So the search for snake skeleton pictures on the internet is a challenge. So that would be the first thing, awe. But I think that sometimes I hear Christians say that, kind of like, well, evolution, like it's not a big deal, right? That's how God created. God created, that's the how, it's not a big deal, sort of let's move on. But I think that there are parts of the evolutionary story, particularly as it's been popularized, that do create some real tensions. We think about, so some of these things, mortality, what it means to be made in the image of God, the origins of evil. Those are some things that where modern science kind of rubs up against some traditional Christian assumptions. And for us as Anabaptists, we may have a particular set of issues because this whole process of how we've evolved and life has developed doesn't seem very Mennonite, right? It's kind of this whole, red in tooth and claw process and competition and, survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest doesn't seem like a very Mennonite phrase. So how could we begin to integrate that? And I think that as we sort of tell Genesis 1 2015 edition, that those are things that we would have to take seriously. And for me, a book that, and it's really mostly just a single chapter in a book, I came across Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist, his book, the Bonobo and the Atheist, In Search of Humanism Among the Primates. So I picked that up a couple years ago, and one of the things that was really illuminating for me is the way that he talks about how, so even though modern scientists have a lot of consensus about evolution, there's a lot of ways that story can be told. A lot of things that can be emphasized, and there's still disagreement on a lot of things amongst evolutionary biologists. And one of the things that he reveals is that the way this story has been popularized since the 19th century has been influenced a lot by certain philosophies, certain political understandings, certain theologies that probably from our perspective would not be the best. So a lot of economic ideas that were present in the 19th century about survival of the fittest, those influenced the way that some of Darwin's popularizers, not Darwin himself, but some of his popularizers told that story. Or Calvinism, if you're familiar with that stream of Christian theology, which has a fairly pessimistic view of human beings, that influenced the way that a lot of people told this story. And so some of the ways that this story's been thought about might be similar to, the ancient god Marduk tearing apart Tiamat, where it may not be life-giving, and there might be other ways to think about or tell the story. And I don't think that, the process will never, I don't think, totally cease to trouble us, because there's a lot of death and violence that's, it's like you can't deny that. But there are different ways that the story can be told. And Frans de Waal, he kind of points to some of these, he pushes back a little bit at some of the overly pessimistic ways that this story's been told. And for me, as Anabaptists, we look at everything from a Christ-centered perspective. So we look back at the Old Testament and we look, where is Christ here? Where do we see Christ here? And I think it's the same thing with, a 13-point-something billion-year-old universe, that we look back from the lens of Christ, and where in this do we see Christ? Where in this do we see, what to me are kind of hints of the way of Jesus in this story. And one of the things that to me is just really wonderful is the different social behaviors that develop among animals. And we could look at like insects, that insects practice their own form of altruism. Bees practice a form of altruism in that the individual sacrifices themselves for something greater. But especially as we get to mammals, that people who study mammals have found empathy, they found altruism, they found compassion, they found what could be interpreted as some form of moral decision-making. One of the recent studies involved rats, finding rats making altruistic decisions, in the sense that when given the option to go for food or release another rat so that they could both go for the food, most of the time the rat released the other rat. Right? So in something, in vermin, right? In vermin we see something really, from our perspective, I think, quite wonderful that developed. And a lot of, it seems like a lot of scientists and philosophers and others, they kind of try to be, debunkers, right? Try to show that, things that we see as, these higher ideals, altruism and empathy and compassion in other animals and in human beings, it kind of, it's just ultimately rooted in selfishness, right? That everything comes down to everything in creation, all of us, that we're just selfish at the core, and that's really what drives everything. And so there's lots of attempts to explain away, altruistic behavior is ultimately selfish. And I mean, there is definite survival value, right? We can identify, okay, behaving this way, cooperating, nurturing, the bonobos, they practice nonviolent conflict resolution. And since there's no small children here, the main tool they use is sex. So as soon as two rival groups are about to break out into violence, there's usually a handful that run across the lines and they start mating with each other, which Frans de Waal says, is probably not something, not a nonviolent conflict resolution method we want to adopt as humans. Each species has its own strategy. But that's really cool, right? And that's a hint of the way. And I think it's this kind of wonderful example of how even before human beings came on the stage, some of these things were developing. But there's definite survival value to that, because your species is going to survive more, your group is going to survive more if you don't kill each other. And so some people will say, well, it's just all about survival and it's all about selfishness. And in some ways, personally, I don't care, I guess, because if everything is ultimately about selfishness, I will take a form of selfishness that says, I'm going to share my food with you rather than I'm going to kill you and take your food, like any day, right? If everything is ultimately selfish, I think there's some forms of selfishness that are more life-giving. But there's also, I think, and I don't think that's the case, but I think that there is something really wonderful and life-giving in recognizing the survival value of those things, right? Because things like empathy and nurture, nonviolent resolution to conflict, these are things we're often told that are kind of weak and ineffective. And we can say, well, we wouldn't be here if some of these things, if some of these behaviors hadn't developed millions of years ago in our ancestors. That these things got us here, and these are the very things that might keep us here, right? So I think there's actually something really positive in seeing that there's kind of a survival payoff of some of these behaviors. But what's really interesting, what I think is really awe-inspiring, is the things that don't fit within some of these evolutionary narratives. Because it seems a lot of scientists, they came to explain something like altruism based on like kin selection. So moving beyond the individual and thinking in terms of like the gene's eye view, the perspective of genes, where genes are ultimately what drives evolution in life, and they're selfish, and their goal is just to beat out other genes. And so from that perspective, if I sacrifice my life for my brother, I still win. Or rather, the genes that are telling me what to do win, because my brother's going to pass on our shared genetic material, right? So that's the way a lot of people explain this. But we observe all kinds of examples of creatures doing really foolish things from that perspective, of helping other members of their species that don't share their genetic material, of helping members outside of their own species. And so it's kind of like we see developing in human beings and in other mammals, it's like altruism run amok. It's like this thing that may have had survival value, it kind of gets out of control, where it might even start to have the opposite effect. And DeWall talks a little bit about some examples, and he gives some examples of chimpanzees that are basically engaging in hospice care, that are caring for and making dying members of their group comfortable. And he gives an example of Daisy and Amos as one pair that does this. And he says, but still, it could all be a colossal mistake. Kindness could be maladaptive, occurring at the wrong time and wrong place. Take the way Daisy cared for a dying Amos, or how humans nurse the terminally ill. What's the point? Many people take care of an aging spouse, as my mother did during my father's last years. What a load she carried, she being so much smaller and he barely able to walk. Or think of caring for a husband or wife with Alzheimer's, who needs supervision every minute of the day, doesn't appreciate your efforts, and reacts surprised every time you enter the room, complaining that you've abandoned him or her. Stress and exhaustion are all you will ever get out of it. In none of these cases is there much chance of repayment, whereas evolutionary theory insists that altruism should benefit either blood relatives or those willing and able to return the favor. A dying spouse doesn't fit the bill. And he goes on to talk about how some interpret this as misfiring genes, that this is just, it's a mistake, an anomaly. And he says that it would be more appropriate to call rampant altruism a glorious accident, but few experts are in a celebratory mood. Their message is rather sour, as if a great theory about the selfish origins of altruism is regrettably spoiled by the facts. He talks about the mistake of sending money to faraway places struck by a tsunami or an earthquake. Anonymously donating blood is a mistake. Working in a soup kitchen or shoveling snow for an old lady is a mistake, as is pouring all of our resources into an adopted child. The latter is an incomprehensible multi-year mistake made by thousands of families ignorant of the fact that children who don't share their genes lack any value. And he gives a lot more wonderful examples in humans, chimpanzees, bonobos. But what I see in that is, if we're looking from Christ-centered perspective through the lens of Christ, I see Jesus in that. And, we can think of, I think, sort of Jesus, if we're trying to understand Jesus in the light of this larger story, that in Jesus something incredibly life-giving, and for us we recognize it as divine, develops. And within this long story, human beings have developed all of this freedom where we can really choose, more than a lot of other animals can, how we're going to live and act and relate to each other. And within that, within all those options, Jesus taps into these hints of the way and calls us to exercise our freedom, and demonstrates in his life and teachings how to exercise that freedom in this this sort of accidental altruism, this altruism run amok, that he calls us not just to recognize that empathy, kindness, nonviolence may help us to survive, but to stop even being dominated by that question of survival. To kind of embrace the frivolity of loving neighbor, of loving enemies, of loving strangers. And Dale had used a phrase that Jesus might call us to move beyond evolution. And I think that's what we see happening in ancestors millions of years before us, and as Gordon Kaufman says, that in Jesus, kind of these very long-standing developments, in Jesus and Jesus' followers, these things come into focus. And for us as human beings, and specifically for us, I think, as Anabaptist Christians, one of the ways we respond to or tell this story of creation is by looking for and embracing those hints of the way. And kind of stepping out in this risk of faith that, even if it's ultimately foolish, even if we can't guarantee that acting in these ways or following the way of Jesus has kind of long-term survival value, that we're going to risk it. That we've come to this conviction that any other form of surviving in life, any other form of surviving isn't really worth having, right? That if making it in this world actually requires us, to hoard all of our resources and kill our enemies and just, outpopulate as many people as possible, that's not really the way that we want to live. And I'm just going to close a little bit here with some words from Gordon Kaufman, and he talks about that some of these violent forces that have been at work in creation, and he says that even though there's a level of violence in the beginnings and the ongoing underpinnings of creation, and DeWalt talks about this as well, that something beautiful can emerge out of that. And DeWalt talks about fingers. That fingers, their initial value was it helps us grab onto things, it helps us grab onto branches, but now we use them to play the piano, right? Something that just probably doesn't have any survival value at all, a total misuse of how our fingers got their origin, but just incredibly beautiful. And it's like, would you want to live in a human world where pianos didn't exist? And so he says that as part of this process, much later, the creation of agents capable of self-conscious action and eventually moral judgments about such matters as violence and nonviolence. And he says this creativity manifest in our universe in the course of bringing us humans into being has also brought us to a point where we can entertain the possibility of living in a moral order that is nonviolent and is loving. And we can deliberately choose to work towards such an order. We can educate ourselves and our children to live and act in loving, nonviolent ways, however unlikely it may be that the dream of a completely nonviolent human order will ever be fully realized. The emergence of moral values, meanings, and sensitivities, together with the context that both require and nourish them, is just as much a product of creativity as are the more ancient material aspects of the universe. Activity, attitudes, and behavior of the sort we call loving gradually came into being in and through the processes through which our humanness was being created. And, especially with Jesus and his followers, they came into focus. In due course, in our human corner of the universe, capacities and needs for agape love have gradually become important and prized.